We will talk about the phone that blew it open, and the evidence they didn't just want you to see, and that just the phone that could end a career in the famous case of the Karen Reed with the system. As you've seen, it all started with the phone, but what it revealed is a shaking, like the system that tried to hide it, and when a routine just cross-examination flipped from simple questioning to outright chaos. So everything was like an exposed style, so everything the jury was just never supposed to feel. And the courtroom changed forever, and the witness became the story. And there may be like some calm questions that turn into just confrontation, but the trained investigator of the Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor so began to unravel before everyone's eyes. And it's like a direct question. So what happens when ego meets the witness stand? And when control just starts slipping and the mask just begins to crack? All of those questions, so they are just beyond the pale, and we are not watching a normal trial anymore, so we are watching a psychological collapse in real time. And this is a cross-examination that turned the case, the entire case. This is just what narcissists do when in the court, like in the real life examples of that Trooper Proctor. And this is why everyone is talking about the Trooper Proctor's phone. And this is a Karen Reed with the system. So when the prosecutor became the story, because the system, the justice system, stops being about justice and starts protecting itself, at that point everything changes. That's what makes just this more than just a trial, and it's a warning. So we'll break down just how a single phone, a digital time bomb, triggered the withdrawal of the Proctor's Massachusetts State Police appeal, and a set of text messages, just discovery of that kind of scandal that might just rewrite the case and many others, which is happening right now. And the entire case and the episodes that we are covering in this video are a breakdown of the ego under pressure. And you see, every courtroom has two battles. One is fought with evidence, and the other with image. So Trooper Proctor came into the trial as a confident face of authority, calm, composed, a veteran investigator trained to control every word. But cross-examination has a strange way of stripping titles away. It turns a trooper into just a man under oath. And when that happened here, so the cracks those weren't just visible, they were defeating. And because the moment as a mask slipped, the courtroom didn't just see a witness fall apart. It saw just the truth recoil and embarrassed. So it ever just wore his uniform. And Proctor hesitation, so the tightening jaw and the shifts from a cooperation to a confrontation. And those aren't just the nerves. So that's ego under pressure. And that's psychology of a man who spent his career being a questioner, and suddenly just realizing so he is one being questioned. And because when ego meets exposure, so one disease takes over and self-preservation. So, and that's where the story of the phone begins. But before we get there, so let's stay in that courtroom in the pivotal moment and dissect Trooper's Proctor's unraveling. Everything started innocently, so like as you might notice, everything was innocently enough. Proctor took the stand in the Karen Reed's murder trial, projecting confidence. And this was a high-profile case of a Boston police officer's death, like a John O'Keefe. And the Proctor was the lead investigator, so the state's star witness. And on direct examination, he answered questions smoothly, like reinforcing the prosecutor's narrative that Karen Reed backed into her boyfriend with her SUV on a cold, just a snowy night, leaving him to die. But then came the cross-examination, and with it, the slow unmasking of a Michael Proctor. Defense attorney Alan Jackson's tone was calm at first, like surgical, precise. So he began peeling back the lawyer's just and those kind of layers, like deep by deep, like Proctor's office, Proctor's conduct, and the jury watched as Jackson handled the Proctor's stack of the troopers, all text messages. And these were private messages Proctor had sent to friends, family, and coworkers, and messages that he never thought he would just have to read out of loud in the court and in front of a jury and under oath. So one by one, Jackson had him read them, and Proctor himself had to speak the word he would have written. So from all accounts, O'Keefe just didn't do anything wrong. She's a whack job, expletive. So he read voice, perhaps faltering as the juror's just eyes widened. Like in another message, he had told a friend that Karen reads waffled O'Keefe's slangy and a callous. And so, like, way to say that though she smashed into him with her vehicle, and Proctor admitted on the stand that these comments were, in his words, unprofessional and regrettable, and that's putting it mildly. So, like, this truth is that those texts were dripping with contempt and bias. And this lead investigator saw the man tasked with finding the truth and was caught referencing to the accused in dehumanizing derogatory terms. And when you're trying to imagine, like being a juror, like hearing the supposedly objective investigator call, like the defendant a whack job and worse, you immediately just start to imagining maybe like a battle in the courtroom, like swung in the defensive favor. And it favors everybody, everything. Like the jury wasn't supposed to feel doubt, distrust, and nagging question. So, like, was the investigation fair, or was it just driven by personal animosity? And as Jackson continued, basically, so the atmosphere grew tense. So Proctor's confidence facade began to slip. And he read another text that this one of his wife, so like after a grand jury indicated that Karen reads and waiting to lock a whack job up. So yes, he just actually texted that. And he was gloating about the prospect of arresting Reed and calling her a whack job yet again. So much for impartiality. And on that very stand, Proctor tried to explain this way, and he testified that despite the juvenile language, none of it affected his investigation. He said that these juvenile and professional comments have zero impact on the facts and evidence and the integrity of the investigation, and he insisted on it. It was just a practice answer and a textbook example of deflection. And in psychology, so one might call it narcissism defense. And he could admit he would just done wrong, so he displayed it. Yes, I used a poor language, he essentially said, but it didn't affect my work. But that's the trick, isn't it? So corruption never walks in a saying, I lied. It walks in a saying, it didn't matter. So think about that. He is trying to convince juries that calling the suspect awful names, mocking her, and cheering on arrests was just a harmless venting. So totally like separate from his professional duties. And projections and denials and their fineness. So he projected an image of unwavering confidence in his case to justify these texts and denying any impact on his investigation. But the jurors are human, so they could feel the hostility in those words. And the more he squirmed to justify himself, the more his ego was collapsing under the weight of exposure. And Jackson wasn't done. So he led the Proctor to another set of messages, like this time some conversation on the very day, like Karen Reed was arrested. Like we see that Proctor reaction when Reed during her arrest booking, so like dared to voice a conspiracy theory, and she said that members of the Albert family, like friends or O'Keefe's, who were with him that night, like beat the shit out of John O'Keefe and framed her in a set of investigating that claim Proctor was texting his colleague in disgust, like Reed or she said the Albert just beat the shit out of O'Keefe, so she's gross, fuck her, like bitch. And yes, so the lead detective called the suspect gross, so used as a F word about her, and straight up called her like the bitch word, like in the text to other officers, and essentially just telling them disregard your claims and again and to hell with her. And if the earlier text hinted a bias, so this one screamed it. And in that moment on the stand, the proctor just reads the vile message aloud, so you could just likely hear a pin drop. So in the courtroom, the shock was palpable, and the defense had just shown the proctor's hated just a Karen Reed, and he didn't see her as a suspect to be fairly investigated. He saw her as an enemy to be crushed. And under that pressure, Proctor's demeanor just visibly changed. So, like, when you're trying to remember, like, this is a man used to being in control, to being the one who interrogates. So now he was effectively being interrogated by his own words, and observers described his tone turning defensive. Like, his answers are growing more combative, and as his hands saw the damage being done, and his jaw clenched, like gun was easy just a confidence. So what replaced it was something so we often see was a narcissistic personality is a cornered with the truth, like anger, excuses, and self-justification. And he tried to argue, even the lecture, and that these messages were separate from the facts of this case, like unprofessional comments, and he kept saying, but they absolutely did not detract from the integrity of the investigation. And in other words, so like, don't judge me that I still did my job right. And this is form of a cognitive dissonance. So he knows those texts made him look bad. So he's desperately drawing a line between his personal animosity and his professional actions. But can any rational person truly believe that a lead investigator who calls a suspect gross and a whack job and just in the private was approaching her case with an open mind? And Jackson insists on that point of a bias directly. And he asked the proctor the golden question, like essentially accusing him of confirmation bias in front of a jury. And in other words, the Trooper Proctor, you don't get to pick a suspect and then try to find evidence to support your choice, right? And Jackson asked, like laying out the principle of just objective policing, and Proctor essentially agreed. He said, that's correct. And Jackson followed up just pointedly. But in this case, that's exactly what you did, isn't it? And the tension in the room hit its peak. So this was a defensive story, just distilled, and Proctor had zeroed in the Karen Reed just from the start and molded so the evidence to fit the theory, like ignoring anything that pointed elsewhere. And the Proctor just bristled at this, and this was the ultimate attack on his pride as an investigator. Like, absolutely not. So he snapped back. And he had no choice but to deny it, to deny essentially everything. But consider, so what the jury just witnessed, a calm, methodological exposure of the Proctor's own words showing bias and followed by his increasingly heated just denials. And the contrast was stark. So Alan Jackson remained just in a cool and relentless, and Proctor grew flurry and defensive. And the courtroom had, in effect, become a proctor on a trial. And it was no longer just about a Karen Reed's action on the fateful night. It was about a Michael Proctor actions in the investigation. And the cross-examination had turned the case upside down. And jurors were now questioning the credibility of the prosecutor's just lead investigator. And if he was willing to lie to himself that his hateful texts didn't just affect his work, so like what else might he be willing just to lie about? So had he perhaps ignored or even just hidden evidence that might just exonerate And Karen Reed becomes so he was so convinced or so desperate to prove that she was guilty. So because once the investigators becomes the investigation, the verdict stops being about a guilt or innocence and starts being about how deep the root goes. And essentially, so in that moment, the trial wasn't searching for the truth anymore. It was watching a man unravel under the weight of the one thing that he couldn't control himself. And at one point, Proctor had to do something almost just unheard of for a law enforcement witness, and he apologized to the jury. And after reading so one especially just nasty message in which he called Reed a whack job plus an expletive, and he actually just turned to the jurors and said he was sorry for the unprofessional language. And imagine that. So the big, confident trooper suddenly just looking over the people who hold the fate of the case in their hands and basically just saying, oops, my bad, so please don't judge me. So like the case by what I just said. And that apology was a crack in the facade and a sign that he knew this was damaging and that he felt this case slipping away. And it was ego just humbled by the gravity of what had just happened. And psychologically, so this moment is fascinating. So you have an authority like a figure just experiences and the public like ego collapse and Proctor can came like in a wearing the badge like figuratively so on the stand and just expecting that his testimonies to solidify all the state's case, and instead he got a tripled bear and reduced to just another flawed man with a nasty digital paper trail, and the power dynamic flipped. The cross-examiner had control and a Proctor's ego was in a retreat mode, like oscillating between defiance, justification, and reluctant condition. And for anyone just who has even just seen a narcissist confronted with their own bad behavior, Trooper Proctor's reactions were a real life case study. So first, denial, so it didn't affect my job at all, and then minimization. So it was just a poor language. And then a blame shifting, so implying that the focus on his tax was unfair or just politically motivated. And his lawyer would later claim that the investigation into him was rushed, so like due to the public pressure. And finally, so when cornered with irrefutable evidence, he couldn't just deny that those were his words. A flash of anger followed by a meek apology, and it's a kind of a cycle of a concerned ego. And this was ego versus evidence, and evidence won. And at least so in that round. And what could almost just see the exact moment Proctor realized that he was the one in trial now. And perhaps it was when he had to read the text where he told his sister, hopefully she kills herself. And yes, so he actually wrote that about Karen Reed. Or maybe just it was Jackson quoted Proctor's own insult, where he referred to Reed by derogatory slur for people with disabilities, and a level of disrespect that would make any decent person in that room cringe. So Proctor sheepishly called it poor language, as if the issue was a minor slip of a tongue. And each time a new vile message came out, the Proctor must have felt another jolt of panic, and these were things he never expected to answer for publicly. And with that kind of projection, deflection, and narcissistic injury, so call it when what you will, but we saw it all play out. So like the confident officer who once projected authority was now projecting blame, like blaming poor word choice and blaming perhaps the stress of the job, anything to avoid admitting, so I was biased, I was wrong. But the thing about a courtroom under just a cross-examination is that excuses fall flat and the body language speaks far louder, and the jurors notice the sweat of the brow and the clenched fists and the raised tone of voice, And they notice when the witness dodges a question or becomes combative, and Proctor gave them plenty of to notice. And by the end of that day's testimony, so like one thing was clear, that the Trooper Proctor credibility was in tatters, and the jury was dismissed for the day immediately just after his final denial and outburst. And the merciful break, perhaps because the tension and has peaked. So in the hallway after, so reporters asked the coroner how it felt hearing Proctor's text about cure, and her response was chilling in its simplicity. So like, I've done nothing wrong, he has, she said. And you might want to ask him how he feels hearing that read in open court. I'm not ashamed or embarrassed. Like, think about that. Defendant who would been just under a cloud of accusations for over years, like, shoot outside a courthouse praising the just exposure of the truth, so while the investigator who was supposed to be your accuser sat inside and likely just feeling ashamed and embarrassed, and the script had completely flipped. And the Karen Treat effectively just told the world that I have nothing to hide, but he clearly did. And it was a moment of vindication for her and a moment of humiliation for Proctor and, by the extension, the prosecution. And in that dramatic cross-examination, he witnessed something rare and riveting and alive and masking. Like, it wasn't just evidence being revealed, so it was a person being revealed. And the persona of the stalwart officer melted away to reveal a bitter, so like biased man whose own words betrayed him. And this was the psychological breakdown for Trooper Michael Proctor under the bright lights of the truth. And astonishingly so, this was only the beginning of the fallout. Because as Proctor's ego was cracking in that courtroom, a far bigger bombshell just was about to detonate, and outside of it, and all centered on his phone. So the phone that started this cascade by yielding those damning texts was hiding even more. And when those secrets started to come to light, they didn't just threaten the Proctor's image, so they threatened to upend the entire system that had propped him up. So the phone was actually a digital time bomb in the nutshell. And that famous phone, and Trooper Proctor's personal cell phone, had already just dealt a heavy blow to his reputation in open court. And Proctor's phone was a vault of his secrets and a digital diary of what investigator says and does when he thinks that no one will ever see it. And as it turns out, opening that vault set off a chain of reaction that is still just reverberating. And to basically just to break it down, like, Michael Proctor wasn't just facing embarrassment in the court, so he was also fighting for his career after that tumultuous first trial, which ended in a hung jury. And Massachusetts State Police had launched an internal investigation into Proctor's conduct. And what was the result? So the result was that three members just of that trial board found Proctor guilty of violating multiple department policies, and he was fired from a state police in March 2024, and in no small part because of those very text messages and what they revealed about his behavior. Like, think about that. Months before the second trial, where he testified, his own department had determined his conduct during the Reed's case was unacceptable and terminated him. Officially, Proctor was fired for things like sending insulting text messages about Reed, like sharing sensitive information about the case outside of law enforcement, and creating an image of bias against Reed, and even just drinking of duty. So, like, in other words, everything that later played out in the court, like the bias, the unprofessionalism, his superiors already knew it and considered it a fireable offense. But Proctor, being Proctor, appealing that firing. And he wasn't just going quietly. He wanted his page back. And by the summer of 2025, he was in the middle of a civil service appeal, just trying to overturn his termination. And he maintained that he had done nothing to justify being fired, and that his messages were private and had no impact on his job. And in essence, so he was making the same excuses to the Employment Just Commission that he made to the jury. So I might have said bad things. That what was he claimed, but I'm still a good cop. And now, so here is where the phone comes in, and during this time, so like something huge happened, like a federal investigation. So yes, the feds were looking into the Karen Reed's case and its handling, and managed to extract data from a Proctor's personal phone, and they found a lot. So we are not just talking about text, so we are talking about hundreds of thousands of files from his phone. So like some dating back as far as just 2013. And the Norfolk, just a county district attorney office, acknowledged in a court filing that they now possess like this trove of information from a Proctor's device. And at first, so the specifics of what was in a trove, so were kept under wraps. And prosecutors even just sought a court just a protective order to keep it all secret from the public. But some details trickled out, and the content includes just racial slurs, lewd and derogatory comments about various people, and including Karen Reed, and even just a highly sensitive data like images of intimate body just part and information about unrelated individuals and victims. And one text chain had pictures like of a private body parts, and even the same of a sexual assault victim, like material that absolutely should not be floating around casually. And this wasn't just a few of colored jokes. It sounded like a Proctor's phone held a cesspool of inappropriate, offensive context, and possibly just a case-related sensitive info that had no business being shared. And for our purposes, so what really matters is that the discovery of these phone contents set off alarms in the law enforcement circles. And inside those messages were time bombs, and that could just explode not just Proctor's career, but potentially dozens of cases had just touched over the years. And so think of any just criminal case that Proctor worked on. So if he had texted biases or discussed evidence with outsiders or made racial remarks about the suspects, like defense attorneys could use that to challenge convictions. And the legal expert noted that this revelation could affect hundreds of cases. So cases that might have to be reopened, re-examined, or even thrown out, just depending on what Proctor's phone revealed. A disgrace for a Proctor, yes, but more importantly, a potential nightmare for a justice system in Norfolk County. So here is Proctor appealing his firing, like claiming he did nothing wrong, and suddenly his own poll just threatens to prove that not only was the firing justified, but that he might just have tainted a bunch of investigations. So what do you think he did next? Like he dropped that appeal like a hot potato. And in the mid-October 2025, so days before he was set to continue his appeal hearings, Proctor abruptly just withdrew his appeal to get his job back. And he signed a one-page document saying essentially, so I quit the fight. And this wasn't just an act of humility or accepting a responsibility. Oh no, so this was a pure, just a raw self-preservation. So exactly as his own colleagues so would later point out. And Alan Jackson, so the defense attorney who cross-examined him, said it best. Michael Proctor's sudden withdrawal of his appeal was an act of humility. It was a self-preservation. And he learned investigators had recovered so like text messages from his private phone just dating back years. And he wanted no part of what those messages would reveal. And in other words, like faced with those with the choice of getting his job back or keeping his secrets buried, Proctor chose to keep the secrets buried. Like he essentially said, "So never mind, I will stay fired. So just don't let this stuff become a public record." You may try to ask yourself, like, what could be so damning that a man would abandon a 12-year career and accept a disgrace rather than just have it exposed in a hearing? And the question itself is the answer. So it had to be something really bad. And he already knew a few of the horrifying snippets. So he had texted and just vile insults about the defendant. So he heard that those in the court, and he had joked about searching woman's phone for nude pics and actually just writing so like no nudes so far to his bosses. So while like them combining a current reads personal data, and he had wished aloud that she would kill herself, and that's just what we know from the Karen Reed case. So like, what about the other cases? Like, did he mock other victims or suspects? So did he use racist slurs when just talking about the minority suspects? Like, did he just share confidential case details with the bodies at the bar over text? Like, the mind boggles at what else is in there, and we don't have to guess entirely. Like multiple sources confirm that his texts include racial slurs and inappropriate language. And Massachusetts governor herself, like Maura Healey, like publicly said that what Proctor texted was unacceptable, outrageous, and it's exactly why State Police Colonel Noble fired him. So it's not just often you see a governor just commenting on a single state trooper text message. So that's how scandalous this became. And even the Proctor's own union, which initially defended him, had to eat a crow. So when he was first fired, the State Police Association of Massachusetts has, like his union described it, and just suggesting that Proctor was being scapegoated by conspiracy theorists and media pressure. But once the phone extraction came to light, so they didn't just about pace. So the union executive board unanimously just voted to sever just all support for his appeal, and they put out a statement that said, "So we hope this decisive move just closes a deeply just embarrassing chapter in the state police history," and that's a very brutal condemnation. Like when your union, which exists to defend you, says you're a deeply embarrassing chapter in their history. So you've crossed some serious lines. And Proctor's decision to withdraw the appeal speaks with volumes. So he didn't even just wait to see exactly which messages they would duck up. So the mere fact that investigators now had access to years of his unchecked communications sent him running. And it's as if he knew that those things became a part of a public record in an appealing hearing. So he might never recover from that fallout, not just personally, but possibly legally. So we have to wonder, like being a profane language, so did his phone contain evidence of an actual investigation of that investigative misconduct? So for example, discussing ways to frame someone or admitting a doubt about Karen Reed's guilt while publicly just pushing the case against her. We don't know, and the Proctor's clearly just never wants us to find out. And now, so like pause and consider the timing of all this. Like Proctor withdrew his appeal literally within a days of the revelation about the phone's context. And if he truly believed his texts were harmless and had a zero impact on his investigations, as he claimed under oath, why not continue fighting for his job and clear his name? So why quit? The answer just practically just screams back. So because the cover-up, like keeping those texts hidden, like had become more important That's the initial fight. And in other words, like protecting his image. So what little remained of it, and took priority over pursuing so-called justice for himself. It's ironic, isn't it? The very phone just Proctor used as a tool in investigations, as a phone he used to dig just through the Karen Reed's life, and even a joke about finding nothing salacious, so became the thing that could destroy him. And he peered into others just as secrets, and now has his secrets on that phone threatened to peer back at his in open court, and the hunter became the hunted. And from a narrative standpoint, this is a moment where personal scandal balloons into just a broader institutional scandal, and it went from the investigator's bad behavior to what else did the investigator tend, and who is allowed this. So because once the phone's existence and its throw were known, so it raised an uncomfortable question about the system that employed and relied on the proctor. Why, for instance, so did it take a federal investigation and a year of a legal drama just for this tax to be taken seriously? So why did the state's police allow Proctor to remain on the full duty for a month after they knew, via Proctor himself in the early 2024, that the feds had his text messages? And in fact, an internal affairs officer testified that the proctor told his bosses in February 2024 that the federal authorities had his personal texts. Yet, so he wasn't suspended until those messages actually became public during the trial in June. And they let him keep working on the cases for 5 months, just knowing he was under a cloud. And that smacks up an institutional just hoping to quietly just imagine or ignore a problem just rather than confronting it, and until it blew up in their faces. And you may consider the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office, once they got the phone data, they fought to keep it sealed behind a protective order, and they started notifying defense attorneys in other cases potential relevant and material was found, but they did so under a court-imposed secrecy, like ostensibly to protect sensitive info. And one might reasonably ask, so was there secrecy to protect private info or unrelated people, which is fair? Or was it just partly to shield the reputation of their office from the embarrassment that their lead investigator was engaged in all this inappropriate behavior and probably like boss? So in any event, Proctor's withdrawing of his appeal was a huge red flag that what lay with the phone was worse than just anything so he would face so far. And it's like someone just abruptly pleading their fifth in the middle of the proclaiming their innocence. So you immediately think, so there is something to hide. And the cell phone, in essence, like became a symbol in this hand. So like a symbol of the truth that was never meant to see the light of a day. And it's almost poetic. So the same evidence, same device that likely held evidence used to accuse a Karen Reed, like data from her phone and etc., like also held evidence that could just exonerate her or implicate the accusers. And it was a digital Pandora's box. And once opened, it let out just a swarm of troubles, not only for Proctor, but for the system that had so confidently backed the case against Reed. So now we have a broader picture, and an investigator disgraced by his own words, and an embellishment is crammed to contain the damage. So let's zoom out to further and talk about what this means for the institution of a justice in this case and beyond. Like when power protects itself, and and at this point, it's no longer just about a Karen Reed or a Michael Proctor. So it's about a system that brought us to this point. And it's about how an institution, be it a police, a prosecution, or any arm of justice, reacts when its own integrity is questioned. And what we saw here is unfortunately a classic pattern. Like the system initially closed ranks to protect its own, and until it became impossible to do so. Like, think about what we've learned. Proctor's misdeeds were not exposed by his superiors voluntarily, so they were forced into the open by an external investigation and by Dodge defense attorneys. And in fact, if the federal authorities hadn't stepped in and just uncovered those attacks, it's very possible none of this would have seen daylight, and Karen Reed might have been just convicted of a murder by a jury that never got to hear that the lead investigator called her horrible names and harbored bias. So, like, Proctor might have kept his job, and the public would be none so like the wiser that a key investigator in a major case had such contempt for the people he was investigating. And instead, now we have a situation where a Norfolk County DA's office has to review potentially dozens of cases in which Proctor was involved. And they have to send out notifications to defense lawyers in those cases saying essentially like, hey, we saw some evidence now that might show Trooper Proctor had issues. You might find it relevant to our client's case. This is huge. And it casts a shadow just of doubt over every case he touched. And if you were convicted of a crime and Michael Proctor was the lead investigator on it, you've just been given a significant reason to appeal or at least scrutinize your conviction. And we've seen the parallels of this in other scandals. So it brings to mind cases like Massachusetts drug lab scandals, where a single person's misconduct, chemist falsifying results, for example, like resulted in tens of thousands of convictions being overturned or dismissed. Or cases in other states where police officers were found to have planted evidence or beaten confessions out of suspects. So once revealed, a domino effect ensues, and every case connected to them become a suspect. So what unfolding with the Proctor has the same flavor and an institutional flavor, so where one individual wrongdoing was not caught or disclosed early, so like requiring a massive cleanup later. And it's call it what it is. An institutional failure and betrayal of the public trust. And the justice system only works if the trust that investigators to seek the truth. No, not simply convictions at any cost. So when an investigator like Proctor reveals himself to be biased and vindictive, so it's bad enough. But when the system responsible is, and its response is to minimize it, like hide it or delay action until forced, that's worse. And it's just that the priority of those in charge was not immediately like correcting the injustice, but managing the reputation of law enforcement and prosecution. And when you're trying to remember that phrase, like when prosecutors became the story, like justice takes a backseat. And in this case, the prosecutor team and investigators did become the story. So for all the wrong reasons. And instead of the trial being about what Karen Reed did or didn't do, it became about Trooper Proctor said and did. And when that happened, so he actually, the actual pursuit of truth was John O'Keefe's really killed by a Reed or someone else got overshadowed by the system trying to save face. And we have to ask, so was the prosecution invested in winning the case than more than just getting it right when defense attorneys accused law enforcement of a cover-up and alleging that perhaps the friends of the victims were the real culprits, and that evidence was planted or ignored. So, like, did the authorities objectively consider it, or did they circle the wagons, refuse to entertain the possibility, and in doing so, allow a wise investigator to rouse the show? And the evidence suggests later, and Proctor was their guy, and they doubled down on him until it became untenable. And this phenomenon isn't just unique to Norfolk County or this case. It's a story as old as the institutions themselves, like power protecting power. And we've seen the police departments protect officers who did wrong. So until a video leaks out and forces their hand. So we've seen the prosecutors hired exploratory just evidence to avoid losing a case, and only to be just exposed years later. And we've seen churches, companies, and governments, so you name it, cover up intentional just wrongdoing to maintain a public image. And the pattern is disturbingly common. So the first instinct is often to protect its institution or the insider, so like not the truth. And in Karen Reed saga, that a pattern was on full display for a long time, and anyone who questioned the official story that she alone was responsible for Keith's death was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. And the idea that multiple members of law enforcement or their friends could be involved in the cover-ups was treated as outrageous, like something to be scoffed at. And yet, here we are. So one of the central figures in the case fired for misconduct, like found to have lied or at least misled and caught with a communication that indicate that he was not a fair investigator at all. So like suddenly the crazy conspiracy talk doesn't just sound so crazy. And the system essentially shot its own credibility in the foot by not politicizing itself early. And if back in 2022, 2023, so the state police or DA had fought Ryan just over Proctor issues and removed him, like turned over any evidence of a bias of the defense, and maybe just things would be different. And instead, they fought tooth and nail, so right up until the breaking point. And the result, a catastrophic embarrassment. A prosecutor, figuratively speaking, so became the accused. And the spotlight swung from the defendant alleged crime to the institutional proven failings. And it's telling that Colonel John M. Jack Mound, or his successor, Colonel Noble, as mentioned, so at the state police and the DA now have to publicly condemn the Proctor's behavior. And they're in a damage control mode. This is not who we are. This was the outlier, so like etc. But was it just an outlier, or was it only the tip of the iceberg that happened to the surface? And Alan Jackson, in commenting on the Proctor's downfall, like said, as Colonel Noble admitted, so the years-long corruption is a systematic. Systematic. That's a heavy word, and it implies this isn't just one trooper going rogue. So it's a culture of a network of decisions and attitudes that pervaded the case. And Jackson is basically just saying Proctor might be the face of his scandal, but he's not alone just responsible, and the system allowed this for years. And indeed, consider the Proctor's history. So like a 12-year trooper with no prior discipline on his record, and according to him, for years he was sharing inappropriate jokes, making bigoted comments, and drinking on duty, and being casual with case information. So did none of his colleagues or supervisors just noticed or reported it? Or was it just an overlooked because he got the results, or was part of his club? And these questions point to a broader cultural issue. And this moment, a public reckoning in a courtroom, like accidentally stolen and shown a light on that culture, and it exposes how fragile truths can be just when this and those in the power feel threatened. So because, make no mistake, once Proctor's behavior came out, so the priority of the prosecutor, so not just to fully concede and seek truth, though it was to limit the damage and argue that none of this mattered to the actual case and push forward. And they had a lot of just reading on the image of the case, like careers, reputations, and perhaps even the DA's political fortunes were just tied up in proving Karen Reed guilty. So the instinct was to downplay Proctor's misconduct, like notice how the prosecutor or on the direct tried to preempt it by just having Proctor acknowledge the attacks, but say they had zero impact. And they knew it looked bad. And the strategy was essentially like, yes, he had bad stuff, but trust us, she is guilty. She is still guilty. And when the gatekeeper of justice starts sounding like a PR agent, so you know something is off. And the system self-corrective just reflex kicked it hard. But in doing so they only further loss the trust of those watching. And by elevating this from individual to institution, like the takeaway becomes more than just a one bad cop got caught. So it becomes how many others? How many other cases have investigators or officials who behaved like a Proctor had, but haven't been just outlined because no one sees their phone? So how many cases have verdicts that would crumble under the weight of what was said of the record? So this case has a sparkled or a broader just distrust, and it's happened here, and it can just happen anywhere. And as one might put it, so like this isn't just about one case, so it's about how power behaves when cornered. And it's almost poetic justice that an instrument or modern transparency like digital data is what unraveled this. And in the past era, like Proctor sins and a bias might stay confined to a precinct locker room or a closed door meeting, but he texted, so he left receipts, and those receipts came back just to hound not just him, but the prosecutors who relied on him. And the institution failed to check itself, and as a result, it's suffering a very public wound. So the lesson is loud and clear. When power starts protecting itself instead of just the truth, though, it's only a matter of time before everything changes, and usually not in the way that powerful intended. So close your eyes and picture the scene as if it were a movie, but remind yourself this is real life. So the scene would be like a tense cross-examination in a wood-paneled courtroom, like a witness on a stand, someone like a Trooper Proctor, and shifts accountability in his chair, and his once confined voice now has an edge to it. And the defense attorney passes slowly, like deliberately, and the air is crackles in with anticipation, and everyone knows something big is about to happen, and they just don't know what. And in Trooper Proctor, the attorney says, like almost casually, like, you sent some text messages about this case, didn't you? And the Proctor notes, so like a bad, sweet, visible at his temple, like he praises. Let's read a few, shall we? And the large screen in the courtroom, like figures to life, or perhaps binders of printers' texts are handed around. And the first message appears, and we see a Proctor's name next to the text he sent, like freeze frame, and the camera in our and just a mental movie, and zoom in the Proctor's face as he just recognizing which one is and he blinks. So did his jaw just tighten a bit? Yes. So there, that muscle just a clench. So he's on guard. And the attorney's voice carries through the silent room. Like, from all accounts, he didn't just do anything wrong. She is a backchop blip, and gasps a ripple from the gallery, and the jurors just raises an eyebrow in disbelief. And a cut to Proctor on the stand, like a swelling heart. And he tries to maintain a stoic expression, but his eyes tell another story, panic. And the cross-examiner doesn't just stop. In the text, you are talking about the defendant, Karen Reed, correct? And the Proctor voice replies, yes. And one word answers now, as if more words might betray him further. And we move to the next message. And the attorney's tone is a firmer and a pressing quote, and that the outburst speed so like the shit out of Kips, and she's a gross. Fuck her, like a bitch. And did I read that correctly, Trooper? A visible, just a shadow runs through Proctor's composure. So like, yes, he says almost inaudibly, like the jurors still glances at each other. Like, did the police officer just admit to saying fuck her and calling the defendant like that vile word? And you can almost feel their discomfort and their doubt. And it doesn't just feel that the image of the professional detective they might have had in the mind. And there were like plenty of the best moments that I've noted are when, for example, like a Proctor reads and they're like waiting to lock a whack job up and text, and his voice cracking just slightly on a word like a whack job, and one juror just frowns deeply as if in disgust, or or another phrase like the attorney points out the phrase like no nude so far, and some in the courtroom actually just look confused for a second, and the attorney classifies. So you wrote no nude so far while searching a misread phone, and the proctor attempts an explanation like it was a poor choice of words, and the attorney punches like poor choice. So were you hoping to find the nude pictures instead of evidence, and an objection filed from the prosecutor sustained? But the damage is done, so the seed is planted, and the female juror looks for at the proctor like he is a crap, like next cup, like hopefully she kills herself, and the attorney's voice drops, and almost just a whisper, like letting the ugliness hang in the air, and a collective just exhale of shock. And even the judge's face hardens, and Proctor closes his eyes for a moment, and perhaps in regret, and his hand stammers about being ashamed of that one, and the gallery stirs, and someone just mutters so like wow under their breath. And this is the courtroom psychology. It's like a montage and a series of just a gun punch moments, so where a facade of objectivity and professionalism is systematically just turned away from a proctor, and each text is like a scalpel, just a slicing off another layer of his credibility and exposing a raw ego and the malice underneath. And we see that Proctor goes through emotional pits, like first confidence, denial, and then as attacks pile up, so a clash of just anger is like he raises his voice in to insist, and none of his affected like his case, and perhaps like starting so the jury with his intensity, and then just a face with indisputable contradiction like a slam of defeat in his posture, and he finally murmurs an apology like eyes downcast, and the dominance that he projected like earlier in the trial like evaporates, and he looks more like independence and just actual dependent does. And from the defense table, like Karen Reed watches this all quietly. So maybe her eyes well up, not with the sadness for herself, but with relief of seeing her truth being vindicated. Or maybe she watches a stone face like stealing herself and knowing that the proctor's falls apart and her chance and the freedom solidifies. And either way, so in this montage of moments, Karen Reed is no longer the central character. So like a Trooper Proctor is, and Alan Jackson across examination has ensured that, and the prosecutor sitting at his table like shifts accountability just like a proctor, and this is his case being eviscerated, so he objects here and there to try to stem the bleeding, but more often than not he glances at the jurors and sees the expressions like a shock, disapproval, and even anger, and not anger just in Karen Reed, the accuser, but at the Trooper Proctor, and by extension, so perhaps as the prosecution for vouching the guy. And you couldn't just script a more dramatic reversal, like forget Netflix drama. So this is the real thing. So no written could just invent a more poetic scenarios like investigator caught by his own hubris and a defendant possibly just saved by the very evidence that was meant to incriminate her. And the courtroom is now like a theater, like where a years of hidden emotions and the power dynamics are played out of in court of an audience that quite literally has the power to decide the ending as a jury. And we hear that the judge gavel rap for the day's end, and the proctor so roughly just chastised, so like steps down from the stand, and he avoids eye contact with the jurors as he walks out, and in telling the tale, and Karen Reed stands confidently, like her shoulders back, as she exits with her legal team, like outside, and cameras flash and reporters short questions. And in this closing sequence of his mental mortgage, and we overlay some voice over, like the narrator perhaps of a YouTuber, like giving the final commentary as his trial, like a footage B-roll plays, and we just like watched a man's ego crumble on the stand, but more than that. So we watched a system facade crack in real time, and this wasn't just a made for a TV courtroom drama. Like no script could capture the raw tension we saw. Like this was truth just colliding with the lies live before our eyes, and it felt different. Many people described it like because how often do trials become so much about the accuser instead of the accused? And how often does the courtroom spotlight turn 180 degrees like that? And the answer is not often. And this was a rare spectacle. And by the time the trial concluded, like a Trooper Proctor's implosion on the stand was a moment everyone was talking about, and the social media chatter on YouTube recaps, like in the courthouse gossip, like a Proctor was a name on everyone's lips, not Karen Reed. And the very people who set out to prosecute Karen ended up effectively just prosecuting their own investigator by having to distance themselves from him and downplaying his role and hiring just lawyers to on a retainer to defend themselves just equally. And for those of us watching, so it was riveting, just infuriating, and validating all at once, like riveting to see the drama, infuriating to realize this kind of bias could have a nearly just led to a wrongful conviction, and validating for those who believed the Karen Reed's claim that the investigation was flawed or even corrupt. And like no streaming series or HBO species could just reproduce the authenticity of just the Proctor's real expressions. So when confronted with his misdeeds, and that slight quiver in his voice, so the slash in his cheers, and those are human tells that no actor can truly mimic. And this was a psychological thriller, like unfolding in a Massachusetts courtroom with a man's pride and a woman's freedom at stake. And the resolution just hinged on not on the forensic evidence or surprise witnesses, but on that content of a cell phone and the content of a man's character or lack thereof. And the montage ends with lingering a shot of that phone, like imagine like it sitting on an evidence table, a screen dark, and suddenly just holding the secret that nearly just stayed hidden, and a symbolic image, so like it's a simple smartphone and something so we all carry, but in this story, almost an agent of fate. And it's a device that captures the private face of a public servant and revealing the truth behind the image. And in the end, so this trial carried Reed with the system and became so much more than a question of the woman's guilt or innocence. It became a stark expose of how fragile our concept of the truth can be when those in power feel threatened. And the courtroom didn't just reveal a case, so it revealed a system that appears its own evidence. Like think about that evidence is supposed to be a bedrock of justice. So yet here, when the evidence pointed inward as the investigators and the institution, so the system flinched. They scrambled to hide it, to seal it, to downplay it. And it says if the justice system had a moment to existential panic, and if we reveal the truth, so we undermine the trust in ourselves, and that's right. So like there is just the most disturbing revelation of it of all. And Karen Reed was ultimately just acquitted of the major charges, like the murder, and found no guilty by a juror or a peer. So like one can't help but wonder how much Proctor's unraveling contributed to that outcome, and the jury, consciously or not, likely had a reasonable doubt not just about the evidence, but about the integrity of the process that gathered its evidence. And she was, however, found guilty of a lesser charge and OUI, like essentially that she was driving under the influence. And perhaps like that was a compromise verdict, or perhaps the jury like that believed she did hit him, but not emotionally, intentionally. So we may just never know their reasoning, but we do know this. So the grand narrative said the prosecution tried to sell that Karen Reed was only just an malicious legislative responsible for John O'Keefe death, like fell apart. And Proctor's actions, like both on and off the stand, like played a big role in that collapse, and he became a living example of a power behaving just badly. And he showed the jury and the world that the very people just entrusted to uphold the law can become twisted by ego, bias, and need to win at all costs. And it's a cautionary tale. So, like, how many times we have seen cases where the question lingers, like, did authorities jump to conclusions, and did they ignore just inconvenient facts? Like, did they prioritize a quick conviction over a rough investigation? And usually, we only just get a partial answer for the penny. And here, thanks to the digital record and the relentless defense, so we got a pretty clear answer. Yes, they did, and they got caught. And the phone, the vault of truth, like forced accountability in a way nothing else could. And DNA didn't just crack this case, and eyewitness didn't either. And it was data, so like simple text messages, and cracked it open. And it makes you wonder about all the other just vaults of truth out there, and every police officer phone, every prosecutor's email account. What would we find if we looked? And it's an uncomfortable thought for a justice system, but an important one for society. And at the end of this saga, like one image stands out to me, like a Proctor, like the morning after withdrawing his appeal, metaphorically just slinking away with his tail between his legs. And the man who once proudly just wore a page, now reduced to cautionally just an example in a legal just a textbook and YouTube documentaries. And across from that image another, like Karen Reed walking free, and albeit convinced of just a lesser offense, but free from the specter of a murder charges, and perhaps like holding her head high and knowing that the system attempt to railroad her failed, and her name cleared of the worst accusations, and even as those who accused her saw their own names tarnished. It was a case between truth and reputation, like power with accountability. And these were the duels at the heart of this trial. And in a rare twist, like truth and accountability emerged with the upper hand, but only after a bitter fight. And the prosecution's reputations took a hint, and the power of the state was checked, and at least this instance, so by the exposure of the truth. And for the public watching, so it's a mixed victory. So on one hand, a potentially just innocent person with regard to the murder was not just wrongfully convinced and convicted. So that's a win for justice. And on other hand, so we have like to stare into the ugly face of how the sausage just gets made, and it wasn't just a pretty. And trust in the system just doesn't just rebound it easily after something like this. So it's probably just a shouldn't. And skepticism is a healthy, like blind trust is not. And this case should serve as a warning to every investigator and prosecutor. And if you prioritize ego and winning over just the honesty and fairness, so if you think your private contempt for defendants will never see the light of the day, so think again. And if the digital age, like there is no truly like a private conversation, like no guarantee cover up, essentially just somehow like somewhere like the truth finds a way out, and you will be held accountable, if not in the court of law, then in the court of public opinion. And it's a warning to us like the public, like pay attention, not just to the crime allegations, but to the process. Like who is investigating? Like are they unbiased? And in just the corners of a misconduct being addressed or swept aside, and the Karen Reed with the system saga like urges vigilance. So because if your defense team and some intrepid investigators hadn't just pursued those texts. So like an arguably just innocent person could be sitting in a prison for a murder right now, and a biased detective could be just still wearing a badge. As as we close this chapter, like one quote echoed in my mind. So because in the end, the courtroom didn't just reveal the case; it revealed a system that fears its own evidence and that encapsulates everything. Like the phone revealed evidence. Those in power feared it, but ultimately truth came out. And isn't that what we want our system to be about? Like perhaps someday Hollywood or Netflix will dramatize this case, to but no dramatization will fully just capture the real life stakes and emotions that played out here, and the anger of being falsely accused, and the arrogance of unchecked authority, and the tension of the courtroom on the edge, and the catharsis of seeing the truth will out, and even if just this once, even if imperfectly. And in closing, like remember the image of that phone, like a Proctor's phone, and it's sitting there with all its data. And in that device, evidence and image collided. And it was a vault of a truth that someone tried to bury, but it refused to stay buried. And its contents ended up just defending the very person that the phone's owner wanted to put away. And the twist of fate or poetic justice, like maybe both, like what we do know is that this story doesn't end neatly. So trust in the Norfolk County justice system has been shaken, and other defendants will rightly just question their verdicts. And reforms may be just promised, and apologies might be made, but the work of rebuilding honesty is just the beginning. Like the phone blew it open, so now it's on it's on all of us to make sure that we learn from it. But the story like isn't over, and this has been a deep dive into the cross-examination that just turned a murder trial upside down, and a digital scandal just that exposed the cracks in the system. But the story is still unfolding, and as we speak, lawyers and judges are poring just over just a newly discovered text and determining like how many cases might be affected and what justice demands in each one. And the Karen Reed saga may be over for her personally, but its impact is just staring to be felt in the Massachusetts courts and beyond. And if this real life courtroom just really captivates you, so you've not alone. And it's a case that has people across the country just talking about accountability in our justice system and certainty, and has just us asking just a difficult question about how to ensure fairness and transparency for all. And on this channel, so we'll keep following on these threads, like from a legal analysis to psychological breakdowns of a courtroom moments. And our mission is to shine a light on the truth, like no matter how inconvenient it might be to those in power. So if you've again like found yourself fired up or shocked or even just hopeful seeing how this case played out, like then stick with us. Like there are more cases to examine, like more systems to question and more truths to uncover. So remember to subscribe, to hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. And we have more on the way, like whether it's similar cases where the system might be protecting itself or updates on what happened to all those other cases tainted by Trooper Proctor's misconduct. So like drop the comment below with your thoughts on this case. Like, do you think justice was served in the end? Like what's your take on the Proctor's behavior and NDA's response? We would love to hear your perspective. And until next time, like, stay vigilant and never be afraid to question the official story. Like, because sometimes, as we saw here, the official story is written by those with the most to hide, and only questioning, like, only questioning it do we get closer to the truth. Like, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one, because in the pursuit of justice we have to hold the system accountable, like, no matter who is makes uncomfortable. Stay safe, stay sharp, and stay tuned.